Let's begin our examination of the consumer's role by examining the Consumer Price Index, an important bit of data that affects all of us. Once again, if you're examining an index, this of course is the index of consumer or retail prices, Dullsville. And so when you examine chart 5.1, the top graph doesn't seem to tell us anything. But when you take a look at the bottom graph and get the rate of change, and in this case the rate of change is expressed at an annual rate, smoothed out over a 6-month span, you really get to see something that's quite interesting. First of all, and most interestingly, it seems pretty clear that the trend of inflation, as measured by the change in consumer prices, was upward from soon after World War II to its peak around 1980. Since that time, the trend has been downward. And so one of the hallmarks of the old economy was that surge of inflation hitting its peak in the late 1970s and the subsiding of inflation today. But there's something else going on as well. And that something else is the cyclical variability of the rate of inflation, sometimes surging upward, sometimes subsiding. Very rarely, especially lately, getting into negative territory. Now, as consumers, we're all affected by the rate of change of inflation. If you're old enough, you remember what it was like in the late 1970s when retail prices were actually increasing at a rate of 15% a year, which means at that rate they would double every 6 years. Terrible situation. Nowadays, retail prices are rising maybe 2 or 3% a year, much more slowly, much more acceptable rate. What was so important about this variability of consumer prices back under the old economy was its dramatic influence on consumer confidence. You will see that as inflation surged, consumer confidence eroded. As inflation surged and consumer confidence eroded, consumers purchased less. And so these huge swings of inflation had important cyclical impacts. Consumer demand fell and rose with these swings. We will definitely want to describe those developments as we go along. Fortunately, recently, inflation's been moderate, and therefore it hasn't had such a marked impact upon consumer confidence. But consumer prices are not the only ingredient in consumer confidence. Inflation was an ingredient because, as you can well understand, when prices rose rapidly, naturally folks' real income fell. So in order to get at consumer confidence, we have to look at some of the underlying forces driving consumer incomes also. And so next we will turn to employment opportunities, which for most households are an extremely important determinant of incomes and consumer confidence.